When beginning to discuss ethical topics, you can certainly do worse than this little work, the Gorgias by Plato. The Gorgias is usually regarded as a fairly early dialogue in his corpus, so we certainly shouldn't take it to be Plato's final word on ethical topics. It's most valuable, I think, for the way in which it sets up certain perennial issues that come up again and again in ethical theory, as well as for the way in which it shows the continuity, despite all of the differences, between ancient Greek moral culture and our own. And so we can begin here to see the unity of a tradition of ethical inquiry going back to Socrates, from Socrates and the sophists, all the way up to the present day. This dialogue also provides an excellent context for the later examination of Aristotle's Nicomachean Ethics, which I plan to be doing. The problems it raises in the case of Plato will be dealt with more extensively in Plato's middle period dialogue, so-called, and especially in the Republic, which is sort of his magnum opus in ethical theory, but we won't be covering that here. As an earlier dialogue, it's traditionally also been taken as providing a fairly accurate portrait of the historical Socrates, who is the individual that more than any other has some claim to be the initiator of the Western tradition in moral philosophy. No one can say for sure whether the views expressed by Socrates in this dialogue were really the views of the historical Socrates, or whether he's just Plato's mouthpiece. But certainly one gets the flavor of Socratic inquiry into moral questions from this dialogue, at least partially. In the realm of ethics, some of the most important issues it deals with are these. First of all, whether ethics can be mastered by a technique, and if so, what kind? Which technique is the technique for mastering ethical questions? Second, the connection of the good with arete, which is the Greek word for excellence or virtue. So the connection of the good with virtue or excellence. Third, what makes a life a worthy one? What makes a life a worthy one? And then finally, the goal of politics, or the true nature of politics, which of course is going to intersect in many interesting ways with moral and ethical questions. So those are some of the issues that we see here in this particular dialogue. One issue that ethics has always apparently had to confront is whether ethical conclusions are merely matters of what people can be persuaded to believe. What people could be persuaded to believe. An ethical conclusion comes from what people are convinced by through those who are skilled at persuasion. This is a view that crops up again and again when people are reflecting upon ethical matters. If that's true, if what ethical conclusions are merely matters of what people can be persuaded to believe, then indeed the true masters of ethics would be those people who are skilled at persuading people of ethical conclusions. In the ancient Greek world, these people were called orators or rhetoricians, and they were often associated with the group known as the sophists. Most of you will be familiar with this term. The sophists, literally the wise men, the wise ones, the wisdomers. It's widely known that the Greek political system in the 5th century BC was a system of independent city-states. Generally, these were ruled by assemblies and law courts where citizens were allowed to orally present a case, for example, for a new law. In these, the ability to speak persuasively often meant that you could accrue political power, significant political power, depending upon the city, of course. And so rhetorical skills were highly valued. These sophists were free-roving teachers of rhetoric who had a reputation for their ability to teach such skills. Given the nature of political rhetoric, there was often a confusion between being good at rhetoric and being good, period. And correspondingly, a confusion between being a teacher of rhetoric and being a moral teacher. And this might have been where the sophist title of wise man originated, because of their ability to make you appear wise, at least, through their ability to impart rhetorical skills. And so there's a kind of controversy surrounding these individuals because of this sort of shaky attitude or relationship that they had towards wisdom. The sophists were often associated with the doctrine of relativism, and the sophist Protagoras in particular had this reputation. Protagoras was associated with relativism. He's credited with the famous line, "Man is the measure of all things." Man is the measure of all things. And the extended version of this reads, "Man is the measure of all things, of things that they are, and of things that are not, that they are not." So that's relativism. In the case of ethical relativism, this implies that there is no observer-independent moral truth. No observer-independent moral truth. That's what we can take as a quick definition of ethical relativism, that there's no observer-independent moral truth. And typically, this also goes along with the view that moral opinions that people have are culturally determined. And so sometimes people refer to ethical relativism and cultural relativism sort of interchangeably, but the moral truths are culturally determined and they're observer-dependent. People are assumed to answer questions about the good and the right based upon how they were raised, which in turn depends upon the culture in which they were born. So that's the idea. Now, the sophists were familiar with different customs and practices in different city-states, and they had a professional imperative to tailor their rhetoric to the place. Like being a political consultant today, such a person would make different recommendations to their employer, the candidate, if they were in Texas than they would if they were in, say, Massachusetts. However, the problem was that none of the particular moralities of the particular cities regarded itself as merely relative. The belief within each city was that the good was the good and virtue was virtue and anything else was shameful. So the sophists often found themselves in a shaky position, as I described it earlier, a tricky position, or we might say in a kind of double-minded state. On the one hand, to be effective at all in their profession, they had to adopt a kind of facade of taking morality more seriously than they really did, or else hold contrary beliefs in tension with one another. And we see that exhibited and exploited by Socrates in the Gorgias. The sophist perspective also suggests that there's a divide between or within the human being insofar as he or she is a citizen of a particular society, and the human being as he or she exists naturally or apart from all societies. As a citizen, he has to conform to the conventions of his society, but as a natural being, he can ask why. Why follow what are, after all, merely conventions, especially if I can violate them without getting caught? So the more sophisticated, and you see the root of the word, individuals inspired by the sophists might think, look, following conventional morality is all right for the hoi polloi, for the unwashed masses, for the rubes out there. But for those of us who are sort of in the know, who are wise, we realize that this is not anything that is really binding on us. If we can get away with violating morality, there's a temptation to do it. So you see that attitude beginning to emerge with the sophists, and that's what Socrates is dealing with in this dialogue. So often this question of the why question, why should I follow morality if it's merely a matter of conventions? This is often accompanied by an anxiety that absent the constraints that society imposes, human beings will become like savage beasts, driven only by aggressive instincts and lust. From the sophist point of view, ethical judgments were not etched in stone, but were a medium for manipulation, a means to an end. The end, or the goal, was whatever the orator wanted to achieve by manipulating them, typically power and the benefits of power, such as freedom and pleasure. However, we should recognize the tension in this position. To posit an end or goal of human action, in this case, the end or goal of achieving political power or wealth through the action of making moralizing speeches, is implicitly to acknowledge an ethic in the broader sense, not as a set of conventions, but as a notion of a good life. And the notion of an ethic has often suffered from this ambiguity between these two notions. So we can think of an ethic in one of these two ways as either a set of conventions, typically that are socially imposed, and second, as a notion of the good life. And because these can come apart, I can ask questions like, is the good life a life lived in conformity to the conventions of my society or not? But of course, if we ask the question of where do we get this idea of what the good life is, we might be in another quandary, because oftentimes the content of our idea of the good life has a lot to do with how we're raised, right? Or how we are impacted by our society in some indirect way. In other words, the idea of the good life itself can be rooted in conventional ideas. And so we can ask the question, does this idea necessarily derive from the set of conventions? Or, of course, it goes the other way, too. One could imagine having an antecedent idea of the good life and using that as a way to, for example, institute certain social reforms to change the conventions of your society. But in the dialogue and the interaction between these two notions of what an ethic is, the question is raised whether there is a natural or a universal rational source for ethics that could serve as a sort of higher court of appeal over the conventional mores of any particular society. So that's one issue that's raised once we start thinking about ethics in terms of relativism. Another issue that the sophists pose is the nature of ethical reasoning, otherwise known as practical reasoning, ethical reasoning, practical reasoning. And here the question is whether there is such a thing. People would generally agree that there's such a thing as scientific reasoning or mathematical reasoning, a mathematical demonstration, but is there ethical reasoning? It's an obvious fact that people appear to argue about ethical topics, but what might not be so clear is what the philosophical analysis of this should be. What's going on here when people are engaging in these things we call moral disputes or moral arguments? Often, what's going on can look a lot like rhetorical persuasion, appeal to emotions. Often, what we might describe as literary techniques are employed when people argue about ethical matters. Things like tearjerker stories, vivid imaginative imagery, and striking metaphors. If I can draw some vague parallel between something you said and something Hitler said, then I can score big points in the argument between us. But is there any ethical so-called reasoning behind this rhetorical manipulation? Or is it only rhetorical manipulation, just playing on people's emotions? Again, suppose all this is for the sake of obtaining power or economic status. This is my end or goal, for which I use the means of playing on people's emotions in order to make them associate you with racists, let's say, and thereby win the argument with you and thereby win office or something like that. And then I can achieve my end of obtaining power or economic status. If that's the case, can't we still ask why this is my goal and whether it should be my goal? What are we going to do then if we dare to broach this question? Why pursue power and economic status? Why? Can I reason to a conclusion about this? Is any such reasoning just going to be another piece of rhetorical manipulation? What if the person that I'm arguing with is myself, as is going to be the case if I'm at all reflective about what I'm doing with my life? I'll argue with myself in terms of possible courses of action. What is going on there when I'm arguing with myself? Am I just manipulating myself? These are some of the other questions that the Gorgias broaches or touches upon or suggests, but without really answering them. And certainly they're as valid today as they ever were. We may have different and massively more powerful and wide-ranging means of rhetorical persuasion than speeches in a public assembly or court of law, but the ethical issues remain, I think, essentially the same. Another issue that I haven't mentioned yet is the morality of using rhetoric in the first place for any purpose. What makes it all right to use techniques of manipulation to persuade people by playing on their emotions? We generally take for granted that there's something shameful about being, say, a drug pusher or a hooker or a pimp, but that it's perfectly kosher to be an advertiser or marketer or political consultant. Generally, the moral condemnation of the whole ad industry that's implicit in the TV show Mad Men seems to be lost on most viewers. Most people are at least vaguely aware, though, that some sort of violence is being done to them when their viewing time is interrupted by an ad. As hypersensitive as we become to ever more subtle forms of violence, microaggressions, this ubiquitous form of subtle violence, advertising, being marketed to incessantly, seems to be largely exempt from criticism, which might say something about the conventions under which we live. Okay, so on to the text, finally. The Gorgias is divided into three parts, each of which contains the engagement between Socrates and a different interlocutor, and each contains a set of different conclusions that are arrived at. The first interlocutor is Gorgias, who's a renowned teacher of rhetoric. The argument proceeds by stages. In the first stage, Socrates questions Gorgias about his craft, both about what the content of his teaching is, as well as what the benefits are of learning what he has to teach. So, on page 2, Socrates begins by asking, and this is 447c in the standard margin numbers, which I'll also refer to in case someone happens to have a different edition. He says, I'd like to find out from the man, from Gorgias, what his craft can accomplish, and what it is that he both makes claims about and teaches. So what's the content of his teaching, and what's the benefit of this thing that he's teaching? Now, Gorgias names his craft as oratory. You can see in the footnote, this is the same as rhetoric, from the Greek rhetorike, oratory or rhetoric. That's what he teaches. He claims to both be an orator and to be able to make others orators as well. This oratory is initially defined as expertise about speeches. But this doesn't satisfy Socrates as a definition, since other things are concerned with speeches as well, other areas of expertise. And in the background here, it's worth noting, the idea is that they're concerned with is techne, of course, from which we get our notion of the technical. But a techne is some form of expertise, some skill or craft, but typically one that can be taught and one that has certain rules for its proper employment. If you're dealing with the imparting of a techne, typically there's going to be some kind of apprenticeship involved where the apprentice learns from a master of the technique what the appropriate and inappropriate ways of pursuing that technique are, what the rules are, and in that way requires a kind of specialized form of knowledge that not everyone has, that only those who have undergone this apprenticeship possess. So because of that background, when Socrates is asking Gorgias what his craft is, what his techne is, and he says it's oratory, there's got to be something that distinguishes this craft from other things for it to be a craft. Just as, let's say, saddle making and harness making are two different crafts, and the person who can do the one doesn't necessarily know the other, they involve different subjects. So too, oratory has to have its own distinct subject matter. That's the background presupposition that Socrates is going on here. And so Gorgias is initially going to say, well, this is expertise about speeches on page 5, 449d. Oratory is having expertise about speech or speeches. But this doesn't satisfy Socrates as the definition, and it might seem like this is, on Socrates' part, a little bit uncharitable, but he says, look, other things are concerned with speeches as well. Any craft that has an oral component can be said to be expertise in some kind of speech, including things like medicine and physical training. And there are other crafts besides oratory that involve speaking primarily or exclusively, such as arithmetic or astronomy. So it seems like being about speech or involving speech is only a necessary and not a sufficient condition of oratory. So it's the generic description of oratory, but it doesn't tell us what's specific about oratory, would be another way to put the point. Socrates also gets Gorgias to claim that oratory makes people wise in what they're speaking about. Oratory makes people wise in what they're speaking about. That's on page 6, 449e. And this would seem to be necessary. People must at least be persuaded by the orator that the orator knows what he's talking about. Otherwise, his credibility and his persuasive power will be undercut. The orator has to be able to persuade his audience he knows he's knowledgeable about what he's speaking on. Still, the subject matter of oratory seems to be elusive. Well, medicine is speech about health, and physical training is speech about exercise, and in particular, exercise that's going to beautify the body, is the way Socrates characterizes it. Arithmetic is speech about quantities and ratios and proportions and things like that. Socrates at least feigns to be unclear about what the subject matter of oratory is. How would we answer this question? What's the subject matter of oratory? We might say that it's speech about speech, or speech about the most effective means of persuasion. But Gorgias, interestingly, initially declines to go this route. Keeping in mind the typical subject matter of the assemblies where oratory would be practiced, he says that the subject matter of oratory is the source of freedom, which he describes in the following way, and we'll quote a little bit of this from page 9. Page 9, this begins at 452d. So Socrates asked Gorgias the following question. What is this thing that you claim is the greatest good for mankind, a thing you claim to be a producer of? So Gorgias had previously claimed that, been challenged to produce the subject matter of oratory. He said, well, Socrates, the subject matter of oratory is really the greatest good for mankind. And Socrates says, well, what's that? Gorgias, what is the greatest good for mankind? Gorgias says, the thing that is in actual fact the greatest good, Socrates. It is the source of freedom for mankind itself, and at the same time it is for each person the source of rule over others in one's own city. Socrates, and what is this thing you're referring to? Gorgias, I'm referring to the ability to persuade by speeches judges in a law court, counselors in a council meeting, and assemblymen in an assembly or in any other political gathering that might take place. In point of fact, with this ability, you'll have the doctor for your slave and the physical trainer too. As for this financial expert of yours, he'll turn out to be making more money for somebody else instead of himself. For you, in fact, if you've only got the ability to speak and to persuade the crowds. So recall that earlier Socrates had said different people are going to have a different opinion about what the greatest good is. It could be health, it could be wealth, it could be beauty. And Gorgias says, no, none of those things are the greatest good, because if you've got the freedom that comes from political power, you're basically the master of all these other craftsmen who produce all these other things. And you can have the best doctors. You can remember when Trump got COVID, right? He had this team of the best doctors watching him all the time in his own office in the hospital. That's essentially the idea that Gorgias is putting forth here. Look, if you've got political power, you've also got these other goods. You've got the best healthcare that can possibly be had. If you've got to give equal time to both sides here, if you've got political power, right, you can get the best hair plugs that money can buy, like Biden, or you can get as much plastic surgery and fancy hairdos that Nancy Pelosi gets. So, if you've got the political power, you can also maximize your beauty. If you've got, you get the point. And money, of course, that's the root of the evil of many societies, because we know that the politically powerful are able to feather their own nest financially. So in other words, the greatest good is the freedom that comes with political power, and the means to this is oratory. At this point, Socrates changes tack, and he questions Gorgias on the distinction between two types of persuasion. On the one hand, learning something, that's one type, learning something, and on the other hand, being convinced of something. So those are taken to be distinct, learning something and being convinced of something. Socrates argues that these cannot be the same, since learning results in knowledge. Whereas being convinced only results in conviction. And we know that conviction is not the same thing as knowledge, since conviction can be false as well as true. I can have false convictions as well as true convictions. I can be convinced that if I fly an airplane into a building that I'm going to immediately go to heaven. That's false. So a conviction can be false as well as true. I can be convinced that democracy is worth preserving. That's a true conviction. So they can be either one. But knowledge must be true. If I claim to know something, I claim to possess some truth. Otherwise, it's not knowledge at all. It's a contradiction on most conceptions of knowledge, at least, and certainly for Socrates and Plato. It would be a contradiction to have the notion of false knowledge. That doesn't make any sense. So knowledge has to be true, whereas conviction can be true or false. Therefore, it follows that knowledge and conviction are two different things. At this point, Socrates begins to question Gorgias about which type of persuasion oratory is concerned with. And immediately he gets him to admit that it, namely oratory, is not concerned with knowledge, but only with conviction. Further, since the subject of oratory is typically what is at issue in the assemblies and the law courts, namely what is just and unjust, it would follow that oratory does not produce knowledge of what is just or unjust. So the orator talks typically about what's just and unjust, either in the political assembly or in the law courts. But since the orator is not concerned with producing knowledge, it doesn't follow that the orator knows anything about what's just or unjust, at least not insofar as they're an orator. If an orator knows something about what's just and unjust, it's not by virtue of being an orator, but by virtue of something else. That's the point. Now, this raises a potentially embarrassing question for Gorgias. Namely, what are his pupils getting for their money if it's not knowledge of the just and the unjust? Of course, we know what they're getting. They're getting knowledge of how to manipulate people. How to manipulate people, ideally obtain power through that manipulation, and thus the freedom of which Gorgias spoke earlier. However, if they do this by speaking eloquently of what is just and unjust, and they don't in fact know what they're talking about, then they're obtaining this power and this freedom in an underhanded and rather shameful way. Thus, Gorgias is loath to admit what is true, that oratory really has nothing to do with knowledge of the good or with virtue. And the good teacher of oratory isn't necessarily a wise man by any means. Gorgias tries to massage this sore spot by likening oratory to just any other competitive skill. So we can see him do this little dance here on page 15. This is 456 D up to 457. Quoting Gorgias' little speech here. He says, "One should, however, use oratory just like any other competitive skill. In other cases, too, one ought not to use a competitive skill against any and everybody just because he's learned boxing, or boxing and wrestling combined, or fighting in armor, so as to make himself be superior to his friends as well as to his enemies. There's no reason to strike, stab, or kill one's own friends. Imagine someone who, after attending wrestling school, getting his body into good shape and becoming a boxer, went on to strike his father and mother or any other family member or friend. By Zeus, there's no reason to hate physical trainers and people who teach fighting in armor or to exile them from their cities. For that, while these people imparted their skills to be used justly against enemies and wrongdoers, and in defense, not in aggression, their pupils pervert their strength and skill and misuse them. So it's not their teachers who are wicked, nor is this a reason why the craft should be a cause of wickedness. The ones who misuse it are supposedly the wicked ones. And the same is true for oratory as well. The orator has the ability to speak against everyone on every subject, so as in gatherings to be more persuasive, in short about anything he likes. But the fact that he has the ability to rob doctors or any other craftsmen of their reputations doesn't give him any more of a reason to do it. He should use oratory justly as he would any competitive skill." This argument, which might remind you of the justifications, the self-justifications given by weapons manufacturers, at most absolves the orator or the teacher of rhetoric of any responsibility for the use to which the student puts his skills. However, it does so while essentially conceding Socrates' contention that oratory in itself has nothing to do with knowledge or virtue. It merely concerns the manner in which cognitive and moral content is presented. I'll say that again. Oratory merely concerns the manner in which cognitive or moral content, that is, knowledge or wisdom about good and evil, is presented. In itself, it's empty of cognitive content and it's morally neutral. This is the position that Gorgias arrives at. This is in tension, though, with one idea of what virtue consists in, which is that virtue is simply what enables us to know and achieve the good. Virtue is what enables us to know and achieve the good. It's one common conception of virtue. If Gorgias is right, then oratory is the best means to the best end, which is the achievement of the freedom that comes from political power. And in that case, contrary to the claim of moral neutrality that he makes in this last little speech, oratory would produce virtue after all. The problem is that Gorgias is ashamed to be completely honest about all the moral implications of his worldview. And we can see why, because this worldview seems entirely selfish and manipulative. And that would be incompatible with conventional notions of virtue. So, to sum up, there are two major conclusions established in the first part. So we can take note of these here. So these are the conclusions that are established in the dialogue between Socrates and Gorgias. The first is that rhetoric is most definitely not the technique through which people come to acquire virtue. We'll call this just the virtue-making technique for shorthand, but what I mean by that is that rhetoric is not the technique through which men come to acquire virtue. There's a strong implication that rhetoric fails to produce virtue because even though it persuades in the wrong sort of way. And this is, I think, is the second important takeaway from the first part. Socrates argues for a distinction between two types of persuasion. Two types of persuasion. There's the persuasion that produces knowledge and the persuasion that does not produce knowledge. So we can call this the knowledge producing and the one that is not knowledge producing. And the knowledge producing one depends upon an argument containing reasons, whereas the not knowledge producing one merely relies on producing a mere psychological effect. So that's the second important takeaway here, I would say, is that there are two types of persuasion, the knowledge-producing one that depends upon arguments containing reasons, and the one that is not knowledge-producing that merely produces a psychological effect. And this leads us to our first discussion question. First discussion question. Is Socrates' distinction between two kinds of persuasion a valid one? Is there an actual difference between the persuasion that stems from argument and the persuasion that stems from producing a psychological effect? Isn't an argument itself a type of psychological cause? What else could it be? What picture of the relationship between logical reasons and mental causes does this presuppose, this distinction? Does this imply that reasons are distinct from causes? If reasons are not psychological causes, what else could they be? That's the first discussion question. So I'll say that one more time. First discussion question, is Socrates' distinction between two kinds of persuasion a valid one? Is there an actual difference between the persuasion that stems from argument and the persuasion that stems from producing a psychological effect? Isn't an argument itself a type of psychological cause? What else could it be? What picture of the relationship between logical reasons and mental causes does this presuppose? Does this imply that reasons are distinct from causes? If reasons are not merely psychological causes, what else could they be? Okay, I'm going to go right from here into the second discussion question, which is a rarity for me. Normally I won't do this, but in this case, I think this is the best placement for it, back to back. So get your pen out again, take out down this one. The second discussion question. What difference does it make whether I come to hold a moral belief as the conclusion of a rational argument or through some non-rational way, such as indoctrination or some other form of psychological conditioning? How does your answer to this question affect your opinion about whether oratory is a morally neutral technique, as Gorgias suggests it is? Okay, so that's the second discussion question. I'll read this one more time. Second discussion question. What difference does it make whether I come to hold a moral belief as the conclusion of a rational argument or through some non-rational way, such as indoctrination or some other form of psychological conditioning? How does your answer to this question affect your opinion about whether oratory is a morally neutral technique, as Gorgias suggests it is? That's the second discussion question. Okay, the second part of the dialogue is with Gorgias's younger colleague, Polus. Polus steps up the discussion a notch in heat because he's not too ashamed to admit what Gorgias shied away from, that everyone would be a tyrant in their city if they had the opportunity. Perhaps the most important takeaway from the discussion with Polus is the conceptual distinction between what someone wants and what is good for them. So we'll lay this out right off the bat. This is unfolded in the course of the dialogue with its literary style in many different ways and very subtly and indirectly. So I think it's helpful to right off the bat just kind of boil this down to what I think this dispute ultimately comes to, or what the ultimate conclusion is from this exchange, and that has to do with this distinction. The distinction between what someone wants and what is good for them. We're prone to equating these two things. I think we're strongly inclined to equate what we want with what is good for us. We think that in our own case, certainly, it would be good to get what we want. It would be good for me to get what I want. It's a very natural opinion. And so it's natural to conceive of the good as getting what we want. What's the good? Getting what I want. However, Socrates points out in his argument that getting what we want is sometimes not actually what's good for us. And the reason for this is that we can be mistaken about what is good for us. Sometimes we're like children who mistakenly believe that it's better to eat sweet pastries than to take medicine. If you accept this reasoning, then it rules out for you the most extreme form of relativism about the good, which is sometimes called subjectivism. We'll use a different color here. What do we got here? Red. Subjectivism, which is the view that the good is simply whatever I happen to want. The implication, in other words, is that good is shorthand for good for me. On this subjectivist view, it's impossible to be wrong about the good. If I want it, that's sufficient to make it good. And also, of course, it's assumed here that I know what I want. Sometimes, of course, we say that, he doesn't know what he wants, but usually what that means is that we know what we want, but there's just more than one thing competing for our attention, and we can't have it all. That's what that actually means. It doesn't literally mean that if I'm hungry, I don't know that I want food or something like that. So typically, there's a kind of certainty to knowing what I want, where it doesn't make sense to say I'm mistaken about what I want. Whereas in the case of the good, it is at least arguable that you can be mistaken. But that's not the view that subjectivism takes. Subjectivism is the view basically that I want something and therefore it's good. That's subjectivism. I want X and therefore X is good. You see how subjectivism here is just a species of the general view of relativism, which says that moral truths are observer dependent. And this is a very radical form because it says that moral truths are dependent upon the wants of particular individuals. So on the subjectivist view, it's impossible to be wrong about the good. If I want it, that's sufficient to make it good. In other words, I want X, therefore X is good. If this theory of the good is correct, then it's logically impossible that something I want is not good for me. By wanting it, I, as it were, make it good for me. If I want it, it's good for me. It's just true by definition, if subjectivism is true. So subjectivism seems to rule out the possibility of ethical knowledge. If to know something entails the possibility of failing to know it, however small, but there's the possibility of failing to know it, of being mistaken, then there can be no ethical knowledge on subjectivism because I can't be mistaken. So ethics just doesn't have to do with knowledge if subjectivism is true. It just has to do with identifying the good with what I happen to want. This leads to a third discussion question. Is the subjectivist theory of the good an acceptable one? What, in your view, is the relationship between something being wanted and something being good? Can these be two different things? Or is the one always to be identified with the other? If the good for someone can be opposed to what they want, where does the standard of the good come from, if not from what the person wants? If a person doesn't want it, can they have a reason to pursue the good? What is the nature of this reason if it's not they're wanting it? If they don't have a reason to pursue it, is it really good? That is, how does it make any sense to say that's good for her, but she doesn't have any reason to pursue it? That sounds absurd. That's good for her, but she doesn't have any reason to pursue it. Okay, so those are some of the problems both with the subjectivist theory and with opposing the subjectivist theory contained in this third discussion question. So I'll repeat this one more time. Third discussion question, is the subjectivist theory of the good an acceptable one? What, in your view, is the relationship between something being wanted and something being good? Can these be two different things, or is the one always to be identified with the other? If the good for someone can be opposed to what they want, where does the standard of the good come from, if not from what the person wants? If a person doesn't want it, can they have a reason to pursue the good? What is the nature of this reason, if it is not their wanting it? If they don't have a reason to pursue it, is it really good? That is, how does it make any sense to say that's good for her, but she doesn't have any reason to pursue it? The more controversial points that Socrates goes on to make are as follows. First, that the good includes acting justly. The good includes acting justly. So this is Socrates' points. Which certainly sounds like it's a distinct point from saying that the good concerns what we want. And even stronger, he says it would be better to suffer injustice than to do injustice. It would be better to suffer injustice than to do injustice. So these are the two much more controversial points that Socrates goes on to raise and to debate with Polus in the second half of their discussion with one another. Polus can admit the point that we can be mistaken about what's good if all this means is that we can be mistaken about what's in our long-term interest, and this can lead us to act imprudently, such as by committing a crime when we're sure to be caught. Socrates raises an example of this at 469d on page 32. So, yes, Polus agrees. We can be mistaken about our long-term interests. We can act imprudently, that is to say, sacrifice our long-term interests for the sake of some ill-considered short-term gain. But this, Socrates thinks, doesn't apply to a tyrant who acts unjustly. And because of this, he sees no reason for such a person not to do whatever he wants. Indeed, such a person would be justified in committing the most heinous crimes, and this would be good for Polus if it resulted in his becoming a successful tyrant with absolute power in his city. Polus's case seems even stronger if it's opposed to Socrates' strong claim that it would be better to suffer injustice than to do injustice. And Polus illustrates the apparent absurdity of this claim, the second one here, that it would be better to suffer injustice than to do injustice. This is on page 37 through 38, 473c. And so challenging this idea, Polus says, what do you mean? Take a man who's caught doing something unjust, say plotting to set himself up as tyrant. Suppose that he's caught, put on the rack, castrated, and has his eyes burned out. Suppose that he's subject to a host of other abuses of all sorts, and then made to witness his wife and children undergo the same. I guess he's made to witness them in the sense of hearing, because his eyes have already been put out. And in the end, he's impaled or tarred. Will he be happier than if he hadn't got caught, had set himself up as tyrant, and lived out his life ruling in his city and doing whatever he liked? A person envied and counted happy by his fellow citizens and aliens alike? Is this what you say? It's impossible to refute? Because Socrates says this claim that it would be better to suffer injustice than to do injustice is impossible to refute. Polus says, this is the easiest thing in the world to refute. Just consider this kind of thought experiment. I mean, who would want to be this poor man put on the rack, all these horrible tortures done to him, and then had to witness the same thing done to his children? Who would want to be that person as opposed to being a tyrant who could have the run of the city? So it has to be admitted, I think, that Socrates' reply to this challenge seems unsatisfying, since it turns on the idea of the shamefulness of doing what is unjust, the shamefulness of doing what is unjust. That is to say that it turns on this idea that doing what is unjust would be ignoble, would be a shameful thing, and the conceptual connection within Greek culture between what is shameful and what is bad. What is shameful and what is bad. And this is, if you think of shame in the sense of something ignoble, something that is, base, that conceptual connection maybe is a little bit easier to grasp. So Socrates argues that, number one, and I'll just read, it's a brief, straightforward argument, so I'll just read this out rather than write it down. This is on page 41, 475, what I'm reconstructing here. Premise one, it is more shameful to commit injustice than to suffer it. Premise one, it is more shameful to commit injustice than to suffer it. Premise two, the course of an action that is more shameful is the worst course of action. The course of action that is more shameful is the worst course of action. Conclusion, therefore, it is worse to commit injustice than to suffer it. So that's the argument. It's more shameful to commit injustice than to suffer it. The course of action that's more shameful is the worst course. Therefore, it's worse to commit injustice than to suffer it. But this strategy works for Socrates only because Polus is unwilling to give up the traditional equation of the shameful with the bad. And you see that on page 42, 475e. Socrates asks him explicitly, gives him the opportunity to give up that traditional equating of the shameful with the bad. And Polus says, no, I agree that the shameful is to be equated with the bad. And that's basically surrendering the argument, because then Socrates has his out. But the weakness of this strategy is that it's vulnerable to an opponent who's willing to be even more shameless than Polus is. And such an opponent is coming up to the plate in the next section of the dialogue. And this is what we'll look at in the next video.